Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, the summer 2019 session. So we are now entering the part of the book about metaphysics, the study of being, and we're starting with Plato's cave allegory in the Republic. So what is reality? What is being? And for Plato, it's what exists ultimately is the absolute idea of the good, from which emanates all of the other absolute ideas or eternal forms of knowledge, and that all the things we perceive in the material world are like shadows of these absolute eternal forms. That's the cave allegory. So it begins at the end of Book 6 of the Republic with the idea of the divided line. So Plato depicts his mentor Socrates talking to a young man named Glaucon, and they're trying to discover what is justice. So they say, well, Socrates suggests, let's make an ideally just society and look for justice there on the assumption that the pattern of the city, which is large and easy to observe, mirrors the pattern of the individual psyche, the psychological pattern of each human being. And if you can find justice in the bigger city, then you can find it in the individual soul. So what is justice? That's the ultimate question that they're trying to answer. And this is part of that quest, the cave allegory. And justice, it turns out, is just one of the forms or absolute ideas that emanates from the ultimate form, which is the idea of the good. So just to give you an idea of what the idea of the good means, St. Augustine famously combined Plato's metaphysics with Christian theology and equated God with the idea of the good. And all of the other forms that emanate from the idea of the good are the ideas in God's mind. So when God thought, I'm going to create the universe, and God made a tree, he was reflecting upon the idea of tree in his eternal mind. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the idea of the good is. So here's a little diagram, and this is Alan Bloom's famous translation of the Republic of Plato, and in his end notes, he is talking about the divided line. So I'm just going to put this up to the screen and see if you can get a little graph there. So you see there's two sections, the big dividing line in the middle, and each of the two main sections is further divided in half. So here's how he describes that. He says, imagine a line that's been cut into two unequal parts. This is page 433 on the left-hand column. And divide each of them again in the same proportion. Suppose the two main divisions to answer, one to the visible and the other to the intelligible. Then compare the subdivisions in respect of their clearness and want of clearness. So here's the divisions. So there's the intellectual world of eternal forms of knowledge, and then there's the material world that you can perceive with your sense organs. That's ever changing, and no knowledge of it can be had because it's never the same from one moment to the next. So take a line, cut it in half, or actually divide it with the top part being larger than the bottom part. And now take each of those segments and divide it again by the same proportion. So the largest section is the topmost part of the eternal intelligible world. Then the bottom part of the eternal intelligible world is a little smaller, and it consists of mathematical forms, as we'll see. And then below that is the intelligible world. The topmost part is the physical things that you can see, the three-dimensional objects existing, enduring through time. And then the lowest part of that divided line is the shadows and reflections of the physical three-dimensional objects. So they're two-dimensional shadows, two-dimensional mirror images that you might see in water or polished metal. This is how he describes it. So those are the four levels of being, with the ultimate division between the intellectual eternal world and the material, sensible, ever-changing world. Okay, says Glaucon, all right, I kind of get what you're trying to say. And he says, and then, so the clarity of knowledge of each of these sections increases as you go up the ladder. So at the bottom are shadows and reflections of three-dimensional things. So that's the lowest form of knowledge. It's imagination. is how he describes it. And then one above that is the things of which cast the shadows and the reflections, the three-dimensional objects. So you can have an opinion about those things, but again, they're ever-changing, so you can't have certain knowledge about physical, tangible, material objects. But those three-dimensional physical forms are themselves like shadows or reflections of the next level up, which is the lowest level of the intellectual world, which are the mathematical forms that describe the physical forms. So if you have the mathematical, the geometrical formulas that describe a physical tree, for example, those geometrical forms are eternal. They don't change. They're the same everywhere for everyone. And what he's saying is that the physical trees are a reflection of the mathematical forms that would describe a tree. And then above that level of these mathematical forms, like if you were to use the laws of physics to describe the way the stars move or any physical occurrences in the tangible world, that's the bottom level. Above that are the abstract forms like justice and beauty that don't have parallels in physical objects. So you can say, oh yeah, well, Pythagoras' theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, about a right angled triangle, this edge squared plus this edge squared will tell you how long this edge is squared. Well, that's an eternal geometrical form of knowledge, and it applies to all of the right angled triangles that approximate a perfect triangle that you might see in the material world. So, but there is no triangle or physical image that you could imagine in your mind that would resemble justice or even beauty. You can have examples of justice and beauty, but what is the essence of justice itself? It doesn't seem like you can conjure an image of what that is. So that is that top level of the intellectual world of absolute forms. And then at the very top of that level is the idea of the good, which has its own unique category. It's the source of being, it's beyond being, it's the essence of everything. And we have to open up the eye of the mind in order to perceive it. And once we do, then we'll understand all of the other absolute forms, like justice and courage and beauty, and the mathematical forms that describe all the physical things that we see. All right, so that's the divided line. And to explain the divided line in an allegory, he uses the cave allegory. So he says that if you look on page 434, on the left-hand column, the second to last paragraph is the end of the divided line lesson, and then he goes into the actual cave allegory. So I'll read the end of that divided line explanation. He says, "You have quite conceived my meaning, I said, and now corresponding to these four divisions, let there be four faculties in the soul. Reason answering to the highest. So reason helps you perceive the idea of the good and also the ideas of justice and beauty and those kinds of abstract things. So reason answers to the highest, understanding to the second. So when you have knowledge of the mathematical forms that describe the physical world, then you have what he's calling here translated as understanding. Now, about just knowledge of the physical things without knowing the mathematical forms underlying them, he calls that faith or conviction to the third, and perception of shadows to the last. When you see shadows and mirror images, that's the lowest form of knowledge. So, and he says, and let there be a scale of them, let us suppose that the several faculties have clearness in the same degree that their objects have truth. So reason is the clearest, and it perceives forms like justice and beauty, which are themselves the clearest things that you can perceive. And each level of being that after that gets dimmer and murkier until you're at the level of shadows and reflections in the material world. Okay, so now, here's how he introduces it. I'll just read a little bit and then I'll summarize without reading so that it doesn't become too monotonous. And he says, and now I said, let me show in a figure how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Behold, human beings living in an underground den, which has a mouth open towards the light and reaching all along the den. Here they have been from their childhood and have their legs and necks chained so that they can't move and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning round their heads. All right, so prisoners taken at birth from above ground are taken down into a subterranean cave and chained up head to foot and forced to look at the back wall of a cave. And he goes on to say, now imagine behind them and above is a blazing fire, which is above the entrance to the cave. And between that fire that's behind them and themselves is a raised platform with a wall, a short wall that allows guards to carry puppets back and forth on the platform so that their puppets' shadows are cast onto the wall, but the shadows of the guards are not. So then what would those prisoners experience that as? Wouldn't they think the shadows are reality, since that's all they've ever seen? They've never even seen their own bodies. They only see their own shadows on the wall. They see their neighbors' shadows on the wall, and they hear echoes off the wall from when the guards are talking, when they're walking, these puppets and statues and other silhouettes of three-dimensional objects from outside the cave. So they might have a silhouette of a puppet, or of a bunny or a tree or any physical thing that you might perceive outside the cave has this icon, this material cutout form, kind of to create this shadow image of it on the back wall. And this is all, remember, correlating to the divided line. So shadows is the lowest form of knowledge. These prisoners, that's all they see is shadows. Now Socrates says, imagine someone comes down into the cave and frees a prisoner from the chains and turns his head around and says, look at, this is the source of what you've been seeing. These are shadows. They're cast from these puppets, and it's the fire in the back that's casting the shadows. Well, wouldn't he suffer from sharp pains? And when he sees that fire, his whole life, his eyes have been focused on the shadows. So staring at a blazing fire would hurt his eyes. He wouldn't really be able to see anything. He'd be blinded by the light. He would prefer to go back and look at the shadows to comfort himself. But if he was forced up the rough and steep ascent, on the left-hand column of page 435, it says, and suppose once more that he's reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent and held fast until he's forced into the presence of the sun itself. Isn't he likely to be pained and irritated? When he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he won't be able to see anything at all of what are now called realities. All right, so then he explains, at first he'll be able to see shadows and reflections of things in puddles at nighttime. He'll be able to see the reflections of the stars and the moon in puddles on the ground, and he can see shadows of things in the daytime. Then eventually he'll be able to look up at nighttime at the planets and the stars and the moon. And then ultimately he'll be able to look at the sun itself in the middle of the day. Probably not stare at it, but take a glance and see it. And then he'll realize, I'll just read here. Last of all, he'll be able to see the sun, and not mere reflections of it in the water, but he'll see it in its own proper place and not in another. And he'll contemplate it as it is. Certainly, says Glaucon. He'll then proceed to argue that this is what gives the season and the years and is the guardian of all that's in the visible world, and in a certain way the cause of all things. He and his fellows have been accustomed to behold. And okay, won't he have pity on the people down in the cave now? Formerly he didn't want to leave the cave at all. Now he sees reality and he thinks, oh, those people down in the cave, what a horrible life. Better to be the poor servant of a poor master, says Homer, than to be, I think, the king down in Hades is the rest of the quote. But I'll read here on the right-hand column of page 435, and he says, and if they were in the habit of conferring honors among themselves on those who were quickest to observe the passing shadows and to remark which of them went before and which followed after and which were together, and who were therefore best able to draw conclusions as to the future, do you think that he would care for such honors and glories? No, he wouldn't. So down in the cave, the game the prisoners play is which shadows will come in which order. And those who are quick-witted will be able to discover, oh yeah, this shadow of the rabbit always comes before the shadow of the tree, and furthermore, it makes a coughing sound because the guard who walks the rabbit puppet coughs occasionally or has a limp. And so they hear all that and they think it's coming from the shadows themselves, and they pride themselves on understanding the shadow world. So someone who's come out of the shadow world and gone through the painful process of seeing the light of the sun now is forced to come back down to return the favor of freeing another prisoner. But the problem is now, as he was blinded by the light, so now he's blinded by the darkness going back into the cave. On page 435, the right-hand column, and he says, "And if there were a contest, and he had to compete in measuring the shadows with the prisoners who had never moved out of the den, while his sight was still weak, and before his eyes had become steady, and the time which would be needed to acquire this new habit of sight might be very considerable, wouldn't he be ridiculous? Men would say of him that up he went and down he came without his eyes, and that it was better not even to think of ascending. If anyone tried to loose another and lead him up to the light, let them only catch the offender, and they would put him to death." Of course, they can't catch the offender because their hands and legs are chained, but they would put him to death because they would think, oh, this person's lost his eyes. He can't see. He's blind, and he's crazy. He's talking about forms that exist outside of a cave, and we all live in a cave, and these are, I don't know what he's talking about, but I know he can't see what reality is. He can't see rabbit shadow. He can't, they don't know even that it's a shadow. He can't see rabbit. He can't see tree. He doesn't know the order that they're going to come in. He doesn't seem to care at all. He has no respect for what we hold in such great esteem, which is knowledge of these things, and they would want to kill him. So this is going to be related to Exam 3, Part B, Question 1. In Plato's cave allegory, why do the prisoners chained in the cave want to kill the prisoner who was released but returned? What does that part of the allegory mean? All right, so they want to kill him because they think he's blind and he lost his eyes, and he wants to make them as blind as he is. What does that part of the allegory mean? Well, then you have to understand what the allegory is trying to say. And what the allegory is saying is, Socrates will go on to explain that the fire in the cave is the visible sun on our material world. And the shadows on the wall in the cave are the physical objects that we see that emanate from the sun. So as the fire in the cave allegory is in relation to the sun, so too is the sun in relation to the idea of the good, the spiritual sun, from which emanates all of the absolute forms, the absolute idea of rabbit, of tree, and all of the other higher forms like justice and beauty and courage. So that's the allegory. We here in the three-dimensional material world, which is illuminated by the sun, we are as if in a cave, shackled head to foot, and we need to learn how to turn the eye of our soul around from the outer perception to the inner perception of the absolute forms which are imprinted on every soul. And when we have opened up the eye of our soul, which seems to be synonymous with reason, when we have used reason to detect the absolute forms from which all of the physical forms emanate, then we'll have self-knowledge. We can be just at last. So I'll just read how Socrates describes it. So the very bottom of page 435 on over to page 436. He says, "This entire allegory, I said, you may now append, dear Glaucon, to the previous argument. The prison house is the world of sight. The light of the fire is the sun, and you won't misapprehend me if you interpret the journey upwards to be the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world according to my poor belief, which, at your desire, I have expressed, whether rightly or wrongly, God knows. But, whether true or false, my opinion is that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all and is seen only with an effort. When seen, it's also inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light and of the Lord of light in this visible world," that's the sun, the Lord of light, "and the immediate source of reason and truth in the intellectual. This is the power upon which he who would act rationally, either in public or private life, must have his eye fixed. All right, so there's the cave allegory. Now, going back to these discussion questions, so what does the part of the allegory mean about the prisoners? They want to kill the prisoner who went out of the cave and returned. It means someone who has realized that this material world is a shadow of the eternal spiritual world, and then tries to explain that to the people who have never had that realization. They will seem crazy to those people, and they might try to kill them. As, for example, they tried to kill Socrates and actually did put Socrates to death. Although I think by the time they put Socrates to death, he was no longer blinded by the darkness of the political world. I think he was pretty well aware of what was going on. But I think also when we go to exam question 1 for part A, so this is all in preparation for exam 3, there's a part in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, that will help explain why the people want to kill the person who has been out of the cave and returns. So part A, question 1 for exam 3, combine Plato's cave allegory in the Republic with Plato's Phaedo and Pheadrus from chapter 9 of our book to explain his theory of absolute ideas. Be sure to cite at least one passage from each. So Plato's theory of the absolute ideas. This is an introduction to philosophy class, so I'm trying to introduce you to that most basic idea of philosophy. And when you compare and contrast Plato's different dialogues, where he's depicting Socrates saying different things about this theory of absolute ideas, when you start to put them together, you get a better picture of the way the thing works. And also, as I'm going through this now so let's see here, I've written down the page number. For the Phaedo, the pertinent passages will be on pages 252 and 253, and for the Pheadrus, page 257. So let me mark the Republic here and go to page 252 and 257. So, especially in the Phaedrus, and I put videos out about these dialogues for the first part of our class for exam 1. And so you can go back and look at those videos to get maybe a more detailed breakdown of these two dialogues, because I'm just focusing on the theory of ideas, which is what most of the dialogue is about. But the ideas in the Phaedrus specifically are said to be at the outermost sphere of the universe. And we saw that the Upanishads say the same things about Brahman and absolute knowledge being in the outermost sphere of the universe called Akasha, or ether. And I bring it up because, as strange as it sounds to say that all of the absolute ideas are out at this outermost sphere of the universe, the history of physics since Plato, and especially in the 20th century, has resulted in a theory that's very similar to that, holographic string theory, which I've talked about before. And according to that theory, all of the bits of information that describe the entire progression of the material cosmos from beginning to end coexist and are interwoven at each point of the outermost sphere of the universe. And then that information radiates in with the echo of the Big Bang on these fundamental elastic threads, these one-dimensional threads, to create the holographic movie that we see unfolding through space and time. So that is very similar to Plato's cave allegory, especially when you combine it with the Phaedrus, where he says that the absolute ideas are located out at that outermost edge of the universe. And so that's why I think it gives people more of a reason to take Plato seriously when it so closely resembles the cutting edge of modern cosmology that was born from Plato's dialogues, and especially the Republic, where he sets out a mathematical curriculum to teach people how to perceive this idea of the good, how to open up the eye of the soul. First, you study non-dimensional numbers, just the number line. Then you study two-dimensional geometry of a plane surface, then three-dimensional geometry, and then three-dimensional objects moving, which is the study of time. The planets are three-dimensional objects and they move. That's how we measure time. And musical instruments are physical objects that move in this regular pattern. That's how we measure time. So it's definitely related to studying physics and the dimensions of nature. Plato has Socrates say that's how you open the eye of the soul to this idea of the good. And so at the end of that historical progress from the Republic up to holographic string theory, it brought us full circle, more or less, to Plato's cosmology, as expressed in the cave allegory and other dialogues. So I just want to read here. Here's my book that I put out based on my dissertation, Psyche and Singularity. And I compare Carl Jung's philosophy or his psychology to holographic string theory as expressed by Leonard Susskind. But here's a quote from a famous string theorist, Brian Greene. So you might have seen him on TV. He's been on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert a few times, and he puts out a lot of PBS specials and other kinds of cosmology documentaries, which I find to be very valuable. And he points out this parallel with the holographic string theory and Plato's cave allegory in two of his books. And one of them is The Fabric of the Cosmos, and the other one is The Hidden Reality. So he says, whereas Plato envisioned common perceptions as revealing a mere shadow of reality, the holographic principle concurs but turns the metaphor on its head. The shadows, the things that are flattened out and hence live on a lower dimensional surface, are real, while what seem to be the more richly structured higher dimensional entities, us, the world around us, are evanescent projections of the shadows. While it is a fantastically strange idea, and one whose role in the final understanding of space-time is far from clear, 't Hooft and Suskind's so-called holographic principle is well motivated. So I'll just read this other excerpt from his book, The Hidden Reality, where he says again, 2 millennia later, it seems that Plato's cave may be more than a metaphor. To turn his suggestion on its head, reality, not its mere shadow, may take place on a distant boundary surface, while everything we witness in the 3 common spatial dimensions is a projection of that faraway unfolding. Reality that is may be akin to a hologram or really a holographic movie. So he's saying in the cave allegory, the shadows on the back wall of the cave, that's 2-dimensional, that's flat, and they are projections from 3-dimensional solid objects behind them, which are the puppets carried by the guards. So what Brian Greene is saying is that holographic string theory says all of the information of the universe is eternally imprinted on this 2-dimensional sphere, a flat, concave surface surrounding the cosmos, and that it radiates in from there, and that the higher dimensional, 3-dimensional objects are shadows of that 2-dimensional sphere. So he's saying it agrees with Plato's cave allegory that the 3-dimensional world we perceive is an illusion, but it's not being projected from higher dimensional forms as you would expect, according to the cave allegory, which rises from 2-dimensional shadows to 3-dimensional objects. The next level you would assume would be some higher dimensional, 4-dimensional. The study of time is, so at any rate, he's saying it's reversing that. Reality is 2-dimensional. Well, in one respect, yeah, according to that theory, the cosmic horizon is this 2-dimensional flat surface. It's curved, but itself is perfectly flat. And so that's reality. But if you read Plato's dialogues, and if you read near-death experiences like the one that the psychologist Carl Jung talks about, or the one Plato depicts at the end of the Republic, he has Socrates talk about the myth of where a soldier named woke up before his funeral pyre was lit, and he recalled his journey to the outermost horizon of the cosmos. They say that outermost sphere of the universe isn't a flat 2-dimensional screen. It is this most beautiful and blissful realm, which has more clarity and reality and depth of meaning than anything you can experience in the material world. But the main point is, it just seems more than a coincidence that this newest cosmology called holographic string theory, which unites quantum mechanics and general relativity, this great feat, the synthesis that has been a trial and an obstacle for the history of physics ever since the discovery of quantum mechanics in 1927, that this union of those opposing theories should reproduce something so similar to what Plato describes, I think should give us a good reason to take Plato more seriously and really try to understand what his cave allegory means. And so we're comparing it now a little bit to the Phaedrus. So let me just read here on page 257, the left-hand column, halfway down. And he says, of the nature of the soul, though her true form is ever a theme of large and more than mortal discourse, let me speak briefly and in a figure, and let the figure be composite, a pair of winged horses and a charioteer. All right, so we've gone over this, the chariot analogy in the Phaedrus. He goes on to say, all right, so the chariot analogy, the whole ensemble is the self. It's a composite image. In the Phaedo, which we'll go over in a moment, he says the soul has to be non-composite, a simple thing that doesn't have parts, because if it has parts, it can be disassembled, but the soul is eternal. So this metaphor of a composite image can make things a little bit complicated. But at any rate, the soul, the driver is the intellect, and then there's two horses pulling the chariots, and they have wings, and one of them is this kind of this righteous horse that tries to obey the charioteer, but the other one is disobedient and is always trying to go after sense pleasures. And so if the charioteer can't get the horses to obey, then it can't drive the soul to the outermost sphere of the universe in between incarnations. So after death, your soul travels, and if you've trained if you've trained yourself in sense control and how to use reason, then you can fly your chariot all the way to the outermost sphere of the universe and perceive the absolute ideas, like justice and courage and beauty. So he says, continuing here, I'll endeavor to explain to you how the mortal differs from the immortal creature. The soul in her totality has the care of inanimate being everywhere and traverses the whole heaven, appearing in diverse forms. So the soul in her totality, this implies that each of our little souls is part of the total soul of the cosmos, which traverses the whole heaven and has care of an inanimate being everywhere. So inanimate being, the physical three-dimensional forms that we perceive and the shadows that they cast and their reflections, they come from the soul in her totality, which traverses the whole heaven. So when perfect and fully winged, she soars upward and orders the whole world. The imperfect soul, losing her wings and drooping in her flight, at last settles on the solid ground. So when your soul is perfected through philosophy and sense control, then you soar upward and you become part of the ordering principle of the cosmos. But if you can't train yourself properly, then you fall back down through the cycle of reincarnation and take on another material body. All right, so the demigods, the immortals, they have no problem going out and perceiving these eternal forms. But for us, it's difficult. Now, if you're comparing the cave allegory in the Republic to this, just notice that the struggling to get the horses of the chariot of your soul to go up this rough journey to the outermost sphere, that parallels the pain of the prisoner being dragged up the rough and steep ascent out of the cave. So there's a good parallel there. All right, so on the right-hand column of page 257, he says, this is the hour of agony and extremist conflict for the soul. For the immortals, when they are at the end of their course, go forth and stand upon the outside of heaven. The revolution of the sphere carries them round, and they behold the things beyond. But of the heaven which is above the heavens, what earthly poet ever did or ever will sing worthily? I'll describe it, for I must dare to speak the truth when truth is my theme. There abides the very being with which true knowledge is concerned. All right, so there it is. The idea of the good is the very being that's beyond being. It's the source of being. And all of the forms, the eternal absolute ideas are there too. So there abides the very being with which true knowledge is concerned, the colorless, formless, intangible essence, visible only to mind, the pilot of the soul. So the divine intelligence being nurtured upon mind in pure knowledge, and the intelligence of every soul capable of receiving the food proper to it, rejoices at beholding reality and once more gazing upon truth. She is replenished and made glad until the revolution of the worlds brings her round again to the same place. In the revolution she beholds justice and temperance and knowledge absolute. not in the form of generation or of relation, which men call existence, but knowledge absolute and existence absolute. Beholding the other true existences in like manner and feasting upon them, she passes down into the interior of the heavens and returns home. All right, so that is true being. That's where you perceive these absolute forms in the outermost sphere of the cosmos. On the right-hand column of page 258 near the bottom, he says, and at the end of the first, all right, so he's talking about the details of reincarnation, how many thousands of years you have to spend at different parts of the cosmos. But he says, but the soul which has never seen the truth will not pass into the human form, for a man must have intelligence of universals and be able to proceed from the many particulars of sense to one conception of reason. This is the recollection of those things which our soul once saw while following God. And this is just, for he is always according to the measure. All right, wait a minute. All right, let me read that again. This is the recollection of those things which our soul once saw while following God, when regardless of what we now call being, she raised her head up towards the true being. And therefore the mind of the philosopher alone has wings. This is just, for he is always, according to the measure of his abilities, clinging in recollection to those things in which God abides. In beholding them, he is what he is. And he who employs aright these memories is ever being initiated into perfect mysteries, and alone becomes truly perfect. But as he forgets earthly interests and is wrapped in the divine, the vulgar deem him mad and rebuke him. They do not see that he is inspired. All right, so you see another parallel with the cave allegory there. Question number 1 for part B of exam 3 is, why do the prisoners want to kill the prisoner who returns from outside of the cave? Because they think he's blind. He can't see in the dark anymore. The shadows, he can't see. The order in which they emerge and the sounds they make, he doesn't care about anymore. And so people think he's trying to make us as crazy and blind as he is. And similarly, Socrates is saying here in the Pheadrus that someone who's been to the outermost sphere of the cosmos and perceived these beautiful forms of being, that as he forgets earthly interests and is wrapped in the divine, the vulgar deem him mad and rebuke him. They do not see that he is inspired. So that's what that part of the allegory means. When you've seen the light, this form of all forms, the idea of all ideas, the idea of the good, it puts you into a rapt, blissful state that makes you unconcerned with material things, so that other people might think you're just insane and they might want to put you to death. We've seen that throughout history. People come and say, oh, this world is like a shadow or a prison, and there's another world, there's the eternal heavenly kingdom. Jesus Christ said that. They killed him. Is a famous example. Socrates is another famous example, and it happens throughout history, and that is what Plato wrote about. So now we're going to compare the cave allegory to parts of the Phaedo. So the Phaedo is when Socrates is in jail waiting his execution. They're going to bring him hemlock at the end of the dialogue because he was convicted of believing in the gods of his own invention instead of the gods of the state, and corrupting the youth by getting them to believe in the things he believes. His gods are these absolute ideas. And he was killed according to the Phaedo and the Apology for preaching that kind of a philosophy. So that's just also related. Clearly, when Plato wrote about people will think someone who's wrapped in divine contemplation is mad, and they'll rebuke him or even kill him in the cave allegory, he's thinking of Socrates, who was executed for talking about such things. So on page 252, Socrates is explaining, well, why am I not afraid to die, to his friends, Simmias, and who was the other? I can't believe I forgot the other guy's name, but it'll come to me. So they're saying, Socrates, why aren't you afraid to die? And he's saying, because the philosopher's whole life is spent preparing for death, to get the soul as free from the body as possible, because only when we're free from the sense perceptions and the desires of our bodily sense organs can we perceive the absolute forms. So on the right-hand column of page 252, he says, and in this the philosopher dishonors the body, his soul runs away from the body and desires to be alone and by herself. That's true. Well, but there's another thing, Simmias. Oh, Cebes is the other guy. So Simmias and Cebes is who he's talking to. But there's another thing, Simmias. Is there or is there not an absolute justice? Assuredly there is. And an absolute beauty and absolute good? Of course. But did you ever behold any of them with your eyes? Certainly not. Or did you ever reach them with any other bodily sense? And I speak not of these alone, but of absolute greatness and health and strength, and of the essence or true nature of everything. Have you ever perceived the reality of them through your bodily organs? Or rather, isn't the nearest approach to the knowledge of their several natures made by one who so orders his intellectual vision as to have the most exact conception of the essence of that which he considers? Certainly. So they're looking for the essence of things. You don't want to see a physical tree, you want to perceive the absolute idea of tree, or greatness, health, strength, and courage, and all these other virtues. You don't want to contemplate all of the many individual historical examples of those things passing through time. You want to see the timeless, eternal, simple, perfect essence of each of those. And you can't do that while you're in a body. So says Socrates in the Phaedo. And he attains to knowledge of them in their highest purity, who goes to each of them with the mind alone. He doesn't allow, when in the act of thought, the intrusion or introduction of sight or any other sense in the company of reason, but with the very light of the mind, in her clearness, he penetrates into the very light of truth in each. All right, so the light of the mind and the light of truth, that in the cave allegory, we see the idea of the good. It's the source of light in the material world, because it's the source of the sun, and it's the source of intellectual light, which is knowledge, consciousness itself. Is the very light of truth, and it enables us to see the absolute ideas which are imprinted on every soul. So I'll read a little bit more on page 253. On the left-hand column, he says about halfway down, all experience shows that if we want pure knowledge of anything, we must get rid of the body. The soul in herself must behold all things in themselves. Then I suppose we'll attain what we desire and what we say we love, wisdom, not while we live, but after death. A little bit later down, he says that, and we make the nearest approach to knowledge when we have the least possible concern for or interest in the body and aren't saturated with the bodily nature, but remain pure until the hour when God himself is pleased to release us. And then the foolishness of the body will be cleared away, will be pure and converse with other pure souls. We ourselves will know the clear light everywhere, the light of truth. And then on page 254, he's talking about, here's evidence for the soul being eternal because it's simple and unchanging, just like the absolute ideas. So we're comparing the ideas in the cave allegory to the theory of absolute ideas in the Phaedo. And on page 254, the left-hand column, he says, now the compound or composite may be supposed to be naturally capable of being dissolved just as it was compounded. But what is uncompounded, and that only, must be indissoluble, if anything is. Okay, so then he's going to say these absolute forms are uncompounded. They're simple truths. He says, then now let's return to the previous discussion. Is that idea or essence, which in the dialectical process we define as the essence of true existence, whether essence of equality, beauty, or anything else, are these essences, I say, liable at time to some degree of change? Or are they each of them always what they are, having the same simple self-existent and unchanging forms, and not admitting of variation at all? All right, yeah, that's what they are. They're unchanging, simple, self-existent forms that we can perceive through the process, which he calls dialectic, the dialectical process. So that's another part of the cave allegory. The way to perceive the highest forms that are above the mathematical forms is through a process he calls dialectic. If you look back on the cave allegory, on page 434 at the top of the left-hand column. And when I speak of the other division of the intelligible, that's the highest division, he says, you'll understand me to speak of that other sort of knowledge that reason herself attains by the power of dialectic, using the hypotheses not as first principles, but only as hypotheses. All right, so through dialectic, we can come to know what are the absolute forms of these abstract concepts like justice, equality, beauty, courage, things like that. What is dialectic? Well, it's just two people talking to each other and trying to find logical flaws with each other's definitions in the hope of discovering the truth. if there are eternal forms imprinted on each of our souls, then we just need to dig those, a memory of those forms up through this kind of a conversation. Here's what it is. No, it's not that. There's a flaw with that. Oh, you're right, but there's a flaw with you say. Oh, okay, yeah, you're right. And then you can zero in on the truth. That's the power of dialectic. It's what Socrates himself is doing in all of these dialogues. We're going to see Hegel talk about dialectic also. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. First someone says something that's a thesis. Then someone says, oh, the exact opposite is true. Antithesis. Then someone else says, nah, you're both partially right. You should synthesize the two. Okay, then that becomes a new thesis and the process repeats. So at any rate, the power of dialectic in the cave allegory, when he's discussing the divided line, which the cave allegory is an allegory of, he talks about this power of dialectic. And we see that also in the Phaedo on page 254. Again, on the left, is that idea or essence which in the dialectical process we define as the essence of true existence. All right, so are these essences liable at times to some degree of change? No, they don't change. They're simple. They're eternal. And when you can perceive them, you will live forever in bliss. And that is what the philosophers spend their entire lives trying to achieve. And if you can perceive these forms while you're alive, you're more likely to return as a human being. All right, so let me go back and look at these. So part A of exam 3, question 1, combine Plato's cave allegory in the Republic with Plato's Phaedo and Pheadrus from chapter 9 of our book to explain his theory of absolute ideas. So we've gone over that. There's plenty of material. If you combine them all together, it seems that according to Plato, these absolute ideas, which are the source of all the physical things we perceive, exist at the outermost sphere of the universe, where your soul can go after death if you've trained yourself during life to control your senses and to use reason to ever try to perceive these absolute forms of knowledge that are imprinted on the soul. And there's the parallels with people who have the vision will then seem to be mad to the others who have never had that kind of a vision, and you need to use dialectic, and it's a difficult process, like in the cave allegory. Pulling the prisoner out of the cave up the rough and steep ascent is similar to the Phaedrus, where the chariot of the soul with the horses struggles horribly to get out and see these eternal forms, and most people can't, and the wings of their horses get mangled, and it's a difficult struggle to see. So it's not an easy process, but ultimately you want to see the idea of the good, the reflection of which is the visible sun. Okay, so that covers question 1 for part A. And question 2 for part B is, how is Plato's idea of the good in the Republic similar to the idea of Vishnu in the Katha Upanishad from chapter 7 of our book? So pages 213 and 214. It talks about Vishnu. So, and in the other Upanishads, I explained in several videos about the idea of the ether. That's where the eternal soul, Atman and Brahman, which are the flip sides of the soul, exist out at the outermost sphere of the cosmos, the ether. In the Katha Upanishad, on the right-hand column, the bottom, so the Katha Upanishad is a near-death experience where the Brahmin boy Nachiketa is talking to the god of death, Yama Raja, Yama's death, Raja's king. And he says, tell me, what happens to the soul after death? Which seems a little weird to me because he's in the afterworld talking to death personified. But at any rate, Yamaraj then uses the chariot analogy in the Katha Upanishad. And a lot of people speculate that this influenced Plato's chariot analogy in the Pheadrus, but it's slightly different because in the Pheadrus, the chariot is the disembodied soul, whereas in the Katha Upanishad, the soul is just a passenger in the chariot. The chariot is the body, and the senses are the horses, and the mind is the reins that connect the chariot driver, which is your intelligence, to help you drive your soul down the road of the material world. But ultimately, you can drive your chariot to the highest place of Vishnu. So on the right-hand column near the bottom, page 213, he says, he who has no understanding, who is unmindful and always impure, never reaches that place, but enters into the round of births. But he who has understanding, who is mindful and always pure, reaches indeed that place from whence he is not born again. But he who has understanding for his charioteer and holds the reins of the mind, he reaches the end of his journey, and that is the highest place of Vishnu. Beyond the senses there are the objects. Beyond the objects there is the mind. Beyond the mind there is the intellect. The great self is beyond the intellect. Beyond the great there is the undeveloped. Beyond the undeveloped there is the person, Purusha. Beyond the person there is nothing. That is the goal, the highest road. So the highest goal in the cave allegory is the idea of the good. The highest goal in the end of the road in the Katha Upanishad is Vishnu. He's the original self of everything. So continuing here on page 214, that self is hidden in all beings and does not shine forth, but it is seen by subtle seers through their sharp and subtle intellect. So you can't see the idea of the good, and yet it is the source of light, and it can only be perceived with the eye of the soul. And that is very similar to the Katha Upanishad, which it's not unreasonable to suggest Plato had some contact with, given how similar it is to his own dialogue, the Phaedrus, which is also about a near-death experience, or actual death and rebirth experiences. Okay, so that will be it for this video. We've covered part A, question 1, and part B, question 1 and 2. But I just want to, before signing off, just reiterate that we're in a new era, I think, of Platonic studies, given the emergence of holographic string theory. Plato says all of the absolute ideas, this fundamental theory of philosophy, are located specifically at the outermost sphere of the universe, where we go in between life and death. When we die, our souls go there, and then we come back. And now Leonard Susskind and his partner Gerard de Hooft are saying that the entire universe is being projected from this outermost sphere of the universe, which is exactly what Plato's saying. The material forms emanate from the eternal ideas or the spiritual forms. So if they're all located at the outermost sphere, that means the material forms of the universe are radiating in from the outermost sphere, which is exactly what holographic string theory is saying. And it isn't like Leonard Susskind is a secret Platonist and he's trying to back up this ancient philosophy. On the contrary, he presents himself as an atheist who rejects all theories of an ensouled universe. So which makes the parallels all that more convincing, at least to me. But of course, you don't have to be convinced by any of that cosmology stuff about string theory for our class. You just have to know the textbook that we're reading. And you can think, this is crazy, it's insane, it's dumb, I don't agree with it. And that's fine, so long as you understand what it says and then point out the parts that you find to be ridiculous. And even if I disagree with your opinion, if I can tell that you've read the texts and have thought about it deeply enough to say you don't find it convincing, and then that's fine. You don't have to worry about me being prejudiced against people who find Plato's theories to be crazy, because they do seem kind of crazy. But at any rate, that'll be enough for this. In the next videos, I'll be going over the philosopher George Berkeley.